Andy, you wrote in your Guardian article with regards to Erik ten Hag's somewhat premature, perhaps, sacking from Leverkusen. You wrote that it was a brutal end, and also perhaps an inevitable end as well. You were suggesting.
Yeah, and I would also say there's a difference between early and premature, because I think it was the former but not the latter. As you say, he'd been in charge for 2 Bundesliga games, 3 overall, because of course in Germany they opened the season with a DFB Pokal first round match. But really, when it came to the games in the Bundesliga, the content was poor, the results were poor, but it wasn't just about that. So, of course, first game of the season, they lose at home to Hoffenheim. They create virtually nothing apart from set pieces. And then they go away to Werder Bremen, one of the weakest teams in the Bundesliga, at least until quite a big signing happened this week, which we will maybe touch on in a second. They're winning 3-1. Werder Bremen are down to 10 men, and they managed to throw it away and concede an equaliser right at the end of stoppage time to a teenager who was making his first start because they were completely ravaged with injuries, Werder, and he'd been drafted in from the under-19 team. So I think people will look at it from the outside and say, okay, the game at Werder Bremen was the straw that broke the camel's back. It might have been the straw on the camel's back once the back was absolutely broken, but I'm not sure that it did the breaking, because from days before, it looked like Leverkusen were ready to move, were ready to get rid of Ten Hag after 1 league game, and that they were just finding the timing. Now, of course, there is no real right timing, because, of course, the transfer window was due to shut 2 days after the game away at Werder Bremen. But I don't think we should conflate the transfer window too much with the timing of it, because essentially I don't think that Ten Hag was ever part of the pitch when they're signing players. The way that Leverkusen do things, their management is very stable, and it's the management that goes and signs players. So the CEO, Fernando Caro, who's been there for ages. Simon Rolf is the sporting director, who's been there for a while and, of course, had a long spell as a player there. But when you look at the reasons that Ten Hag was binned, I mean, Rolf has talked about it in a press conference directly after they'd released the news on Monday morning. So yes, he was actually fired on transfer deadline day, which is extraordinary when you say it like that. But this had been coming for a while, and I think the way that Rolf has put it was quite interesting. He said, "I made a mistake, but not doing anything about it would have been an even bigger mistake." And he said to not read too much into the Werder Bremen game. And so really, not only could they have sacked him after 1 Bundesliga game, they might have sacked him after no Bundesliga games. You're talking about Gigi Del Neri at Porto sort of business, really, because right from the beginning, he wasn't first choice, which, okay, you could say that was the same with Vincent Kompany at Bayern, for example. That doesn't necessarily need to be a deal breaker. But right from the moment where a couple of weeks in, they go on this promotional tour of Brazil and they lose 5-1 to Flamengo's under-20 teams. And he says, well, obviously that shouldn't happen. But, the game was too early and no one really gives a shit about friendly results.
He never said that.
He did say that.
Oh, my goodness.
And it's like, maybe it's fine to think that. I'm not sure it's fine to say that out loud. And there are a load of other reasons behind the scenes that made the management lose confidence in him. And of course, there was no real senior player base of support behind him. A, because Xabi Alonso had gone and they'd developed no real relationship with him. And of course, a lot of the senior players went this summer. You look at Xhaka, Radetzky, of course, we obviously think about Wirtz and Frimpong straight away, but the steering group of the team, of the dressing room, of the squad is an important thing to think about. And so obviously this was something that Ten Hag used in his quite salty defence, his quite sort of virulent riposte, the statement he made later on Monday. But yeah, it's not about all the players being sold, and it's not just about the results.
Yeah, Lars, Ten Hag in his defence says that Leverkusen didn't give him the time or the space to implement his vision. And he stated that this was never a relationship based on mutual trust. I don't know if you can decipher that last bit, but the first two parts, time and space, I think we'd have to agree with that. They didn't give him the time. They didn't give him the space.
That might be true, but I thought that statement was kind of unintentionally funny because he really flags up that like sacking someone after 2 games is unprecedented. And I was like, mate, if I were you, I wouldn't flag up the fact that you'd worked there already for like they absolutely could not continue working with me. It's like not the thing I would choose. It's not what I would want the emphasis to be on. No, I think Andy's really like given a very comprehensive summary of events there, and you can say that they. I think they will. The management, which has, like Andy says, has been stable, has been there for a while. When they have seen him work, they have seen his team play friendlies. They know they've had conversations with him, presumably, and if they've decided that this is not going to work, that this is, as I think they said in the statement, that being successful in this way was not feasible, then it's better to do something quickly than to just kind of let it drag along, I think. Firing Erik ten Hag at the right time, maybe something for big Sir Jim Radcliffe and Ineos to sort of take note of, I guess. And it's just the defense for him, as Andy has touched on, will be the huge turnover of the team, right? Because they've lost in Wirtz, they've lost the guy who was the creative reference point. They've lost the leadership of Xhaka. They've also lost Jonathan Tah in defense. Lucas Radecki as a goalkeeper had his critics, and he was maybe a little gaff prone, but he was a big character in the dressing room. He's someone who's a big joker. He's very funny. He's a very likable and well liked guy. A lot of people left, and fashioning a team of the incoming players who are all on the young side, pretty much, because this is Leverkusen. It's not easy. Like, no one should say that it's easy. But it's also like, you can't, if you're convinced that this is wrong, it's better to do something about it. And it's worth remembering that Erik ten Hag was nowhere near their first choice for the job. They wanted Fabregas. They were pretty far along with Fabregas, really, but they couldn't make that happen. Suggestions they were thinking about Xavi at some point. They wanted a slightly different profile than Ten Hag, and as much as we were trying to make a case for him on this pod a few weeks ago, I'm not completely shocked that it's gone this way, to be perfectly honest. I just think, have you ever listened to an interview with Erik ten Hag and thought, yeah, this seems like a very sensible guy? Like at United, I remember I kept trying to find ways of feeling sorry for him and having sympathy with him, and every time he opened his mouth, I'm like, I'm not sure about him. And I spoke to an acquaintance of mine who knows Dutch football very, very well, who suggested that it'd be better for Ten Hag in Germany because they're just kind of used to Dutch people being a bit weird, so there'd be more tolerance for it. But evidently not.
The one excuse that Ten Hag didn't use, to be fair, or maybe he should have, is that, look, Leverkusen have done me up like a kipper on this one because they had issues to start off with from the moment Xabi Alonso left, and they expected me to fill in, to follow that act, which was an impossible act.
Yeah,
to follow.
That is true. I mean, he did kind of make that excuse when he talked about them like selling the players and all the rest of it. I think, one naturally implies the other. You could argue. I mean, one of the major things, and one of the major things that made the club lose confidence in him was the Granit Xhaka thing. I mean, on one hand, you can have some sympathy that he's lost a leader. I think there's a question over whether Xhaka continues to be a relevant leader when Xabi Alonso's not there, because the two are so closely associated in their Leverkusen period. Alonso says on a number of occasions, Xhaka is me on the pitch, and Rolfes says Xhaka also has the authority to say stuff that's more unpleasant than any of us would say to actually get people to do things. And if someone who's so closely associated with the previous manager, I think if I was the new coach, I would want someone different to lead the team, rather than have someone who's extremely loyal to the old guy. To me, it makes sense. I think if you look at one of the first things, say, Andre Villas-Boas, when he has that very successful season at Porto, one of the key points to that, he gets there and he dumps a couple of experienced players. He gets rid of Raul Morelos, not because he doesn't think he's good, but it's like, yeah, okay, you're the old power in the dressing room and I need to get my voice across. So to me, that seems strange. And the club thought that was a bit strange as well, because the way they saw it, here's a guy in his 30s who's got a fairly long, fairly lucrative contract. They've got offers for him, and maybe it's the right time to cash in and move on. Now, Rolfes and Caro speak to Ten Hag about this. They think it's all agreed. And then in the next press conference, he goes, well, I don't think we should sell Xhaka. I think that would be a really bad sign. He's my captain. In fact, we're not going to sell him. And they're obviously sat there in the boardroom going, what are you doing? Don't do this. And it's moments like that, really, that shake the authority. And then you can see that his difficulty in really getting his authority across in the dressing room is clear, because after that first game, in which, as I said, they were awful against Hoffenheim, Mark Flecken, new goalkeeper, just made his Bundesliga debut. He says to the journalist, well, we did a few good things in that, but we did a lot of bad things in that. And he goes on to basically tear his team's performance to bits. And it's like, okay, one of the senior players doing this, say if it's a Robert Andrich, that's fine. I think, you expect a certain bluntness from him. But you just turned up and you're critiquing everyone's performance. I don't think that shows an enormous amount of respect for the coach. And look, they have sold a lot of players, but they're also getting in a lot of players. You look at some of the quality that they've bought over the last week or so. Loic Barret, who's brilliant for Sevilla and is someone who will become a regular in the France squad. He's just arrived. Elise Ben-Seguir has arrived from Monaco. Eki Fernandez. These are players who they've spent good money on, and players who can be their future. So they can be the next Wirtz or Frimpong in terms of transfer profit. So you're entrusting the coach with their development. It's not just about, if we're talking about Leverkusen.
Is that what they wanted primarily? Sorry to cut you. Is that what they wanted primarily from employing Erik ten Hag, to develop the younger players?
That's what they want from any coach.
Yeah.
Because I think to say Leverkusen, as we said before, I think on here a couple of weeks ago, they're acutely aware of what they are. Then if they go out and spend like they're still trying to keep pace with Bayern, that makes absolutely no sense. And if they act like they're still trying to keep pace with Bayern, that makes no sense to the club, to the business model. That is the road to ruin. Whereas if they realise we've had a couple of great years, which they do, by the way, they realise we've had a couple of great years, but what we need to do is what we've not done in the last 10 years and consistently qualify for the Champions League, and to have a club style and a playing style, and we allow that to be our continuity. We consistently qualify for the Champions League, and in good seasons, maybe we can challenge Bayern, because they realise that that's who they are and that's where they are. And I think the interesting thing is it appears that in a successor, they are looking for a Spanish speaker.
Okay, we'll come to that in a moment. If you don't, dun. Thank you very much for leaving us on a cliffhanger. But one other question, and I'll pose this to you, Lars. If they're looking for a coach to develop young talent, they wouldn't have chosen Erik ten Hag, given his experience at Manchester United. If anything, you'd almost go anywhere else.
They think they're getting Ajax ten Hag rather than United ten Hag, don't they, Lars?
This is the problem,
yeah,
isn't it?
So I'm going to disagree with you there, Dotun, because I think one of the very few things that went right under ten Hag at United was that he did give minutes to young players who looked all right. Like, that was always the silver lining at United, is that you had Garnacho coming through, you had you had Mainu, I guess, was under him as well, and so there were, there was a sense that the kids were all right, even if very little else was. And as a side note as well, Mark Flecken, talking out of turn, also a Dutch guy. Maybe this is just the cost of doing business if you're going to have Dutch people in the building. Like, they will say things to the media you might not want them to say. It's just, you have to take that. But I definitely think it would be logical to look at tonight, because I'm keenly aware, we spoke about this. We had a segment on this on the pod not that long ago, talking about how Ten Hag might fit into Leverkusen, and this was one of the things we spoke about. I think of in his very fantastically salty statement, you honed in on it a little earlier, Dotun. I think it's interesting that he flagged up that there wasn't trust there, and maybe there's an element of these players that were brought in, maybe he didn't feel like he was heard enough, that his priorities were not taken into account. That's possible. But I also just think, like, for the reasons Andy's flagged up, it doesn't seem to have been a happy marriage as well. Maybe he didn't realize what the job was when maybe he did. Maybe he thought he was gonna. Maybe he thought he was going to be a more traditional manager rather than a head coach who is there to get the best out of the young players that the club brings in.
What about the future then, Andy? We'll get back onto the Spanish speaking now, but where does Leverkusen go from here? Even though you said, look, they might be pragmatic and think we've had a couple of good seasons, but let's be realistic. However, their supporters are going to be thinking, we've had a couple of good seasons, we'd like another couple of good seasons. Where do they go from here?
But it's what they define as good season. I don't think anyone who supports Leverkusen has really forgotten who they are and what they're about. I don't think they're expecting more Xabi Alonso-esque magic, however Spanish or otherwise the next coach might be. I just said Spanish speaking, by the way, not Spanish.
Oh, good point. Even I speak some Spanish,
that's important.
But I'm not in the running.
I think yet.
Thank you.
But I think that they're hoping to get it done quite quickly. They were saying this week that they're hoping to have a new coach in place for Tuesday, which is when most of the players will be back from international duty. But connecting to a couple of those key guys is important. Like we said, they've spent, 30 mil on bringing in Eki Fernandez, who is the replacement for Granit Xhaka, who's 10 years younger than him and one of the ones that they certainly hope to develop into a superstar. So maybe that's part of it. But of course, when you've got a golden era like that, you also really want to have something similar in terms of philosophy, in terms of outlook, in terms of core principles, which was why they were so, even though he doesn't play exactly the same football as Xabi Alonso, that's why they were so high on Fabregas. And that's why they thought he would have been perfect, even though, whoever follows Alonso, as you pointed out at the start, it's a massive risk and it's an impossible task.
And he, of course, speaks Spanish or Catalan. So gracias for that, Andy. Who's in the running for this? Who are the runners and riders? Do you want to go with that first, Lars? Who are the likely contenders?
Well, from what Andy says, if they want someone in the mold of Xabi Alonso, and they would like a Spanish speaker and maybe a former midfielder, maybe that's a theme here. You have to think, well, what's Xavi up to at the moment? Like, maybe that's something you would have to consider. Aside from that, I mean, I guess you just look up like for Spanish-speaking former central midfielders that are available on the market. I guess, is that what we're looking at, Andy?
Yeah, I guess that is the question. I mean, look, the biggest free agents that come from a Bundesliga sort of perspective, you're looking at going back to Roger Schmidt or Marco Rosa. Both in terms of the sort of football they want to play, there's something to recommend them. I suspect they have something else up their sleeve.
Thank you. Oh, just on a final note, what happens to Erik ten Hag now? Surely his kudos has left and exited the building?
Well, it hasn't helped. I think a sabbatical is in order, a bit of TV work.
If we can continue with the Spanish theme that Andy has brought into the conversation. And by the way, Lars, buenos dias. I was wondering, what has happened to Barcelona? Because they ended last season on a high, as if they were galloping to the races. And they've started this season on a low, as if they're trotting to the finish line.
I suppose you can say that. Yeah, they dropped points against Rayo Vallecano at the weekend, and of course they were in trouble against Levante in the game before that, the weekend before, where they were 2-0 down at halftime and had to turn it around in the second half. You don't want to be 2-0 down against Levante. That's not a good sign. And right, the game against Rayo was a bit of a funny one. The pitch was not in good condition. VAR was not working the entire game. It didn't work for a while, and then it worked again. It was a very odd spectacle, but it was a very unconvincing performance. You wonder. There are more big picture questions that we can get to, but I wonder about the defense a little bit. I see them line up with with Erik Garcia and Andreas Christensen at centre half, and think this is maybe not a La Liga winning centre half pairing, lads. I'm kind of surprised that there was no Araujo or Kubarsi were not playing, and I do wonder if Martinez leaving is potentially a little bit bad for them because he had a lot of experience. I think because you're asking them to play. Obviously, Flick is asking them to play this incredibly high line, and even though Martinez is not a young buck anymore, he's very experienced. His leadership, I wonder, could be missed at the back there. And just in general, you wonder if, for a guy who puts really, really, really high physical demands on his squad, if it would have been a good idea to freshen up that squad a little bit more in the summer. But of course, with Barcelona's well-known financial problems, which are becoming worse through their own actions, that was always going to be a challenge.
I think the Inigo Martinez thing, I think Lars is absolutely right. They didn't want him to go. Hansi Flick definitely didn't want him to go. To save themselves a few euros, Deco insisted that he ask for a transfer before he went to Saudi, because otherwise they would have been forced to pay him a loyalty bonus. Obviously, the same thing happened with Fermin, and one of the main reasons that Fermin Lopez didn't go is because he wouldn't ask for a transfer, and Deco was like, well, that's going to cost us more money, so no, in that case. As well as I don't think Chelsea really hit the level they wanted in terms of fee, etc. But yeah, I think Inigo Martinez was one of the low-key standouts for Barcelona last season, and I think that's easily overlooked because they were so attractive at the other end of the pitch. Yeah, but I think that's the thing, really, isn't it? When Barcelona don't really pop in the front part of the pitch, that makes us analyse the rest of the team in sort of painstaking detail. And so I think Lars is right. You know, new goalkeeper, who's a good goalkeeper, Joan Garcia, I think will end up really working out for them. But of course, he's got to develop a relationship with his back four. That's going to take time as well. And yeah, I thought they were really flat in this game with Rayo. And I think what was really interesting is afterwards, Hansi Flick ends up talking about like the lack of unity that there is. I find that something quite extraordinary for a head coach to come out with after a couple of games of the season. Now, presumably, this is meant as a kick up the backside to, you know, bring the champion side of us out and all the rest of it. But this, coupled with all the talk of, well, not the talk, is clearly the case. The row between Rafinha and Ter Stegen, which started last season, has not been resolved. Rafinha really unhappy actually with the way that he feels Ter Stegen has thrown the club under the bus latterly with his delaying his medical declaration, and that affected their flexibility in the transfer market and their flexibility in registering new signings, which obviously was a bit of a drama before the first game of the season. Remember, Marcus Rashford was only registered at 10:30 a.m. on the morning of the first game at Mallorca, which is extraordinary, really. Or would be more extraordinary if it wasn't Barcelona, obviously. And then you've got this row between Gavi and Fermin, which is an issue as well. Again, Fermin was peripatetically really important for them last season too. But I guess going back to Lars's main point, that the freshness is an issue, really. So we can talk about egos and expectation increased from last season. I guess like we're looking we're looking at two things, not just what they can do in the transfer market, but how Hansi Flick can work with what he's got, because we know they are where they are in the transfer market. And if Marcus Rashford doesn't work out for them, that is a huge blow. That is something that they really need him to work. And I guess we'll come back to Rashford in a minute, because I do think it is quite a big issue. But like I said, the other half of it is Hansi Flick, because remember, after the treble-winning season at Bayern, and it could have easily been a treble-winning season last season for Barcelona because they were excellent in most of the Champions League as well. He struggled to build on that with Bayern, and in terms of getting the right signings out of the board, in terms of ego management. 6-7 months in, he thought, right, I'm tired of this. and he was off. And I wonder if the same thing happens again. I think he's probably got that in mind. He's got in mind, okay, I need to lock this situation down early on in a way that I wasn't able to do at Bayern. I think that's probably part of what his public declarations are about.
Do you buy that, Lars?
I think that sounds very plausible, and I mean, I do want to point out that, like, okay, we're going off reporting here now, but what has been said or what has been published as a story is that this row between Fermin and Gavi essentially starts with their girlfriends not getting along. Now, that may be true or not, but it's certainly what's being said. And I just imagine Hansi Flick, like, with all the stuff you have to deal with as Barcelona manager already and trying to make the team work. Now I have a problem because my two very young midfielders, their girlfriends don't get on, and it's causing a problem for me. I think that would be the kind of nonsense that makes you want to, like, oh God, I don't want to deal with this. Like, this is not what you really sign up for. But I guess that is part of the joy of the Barcelona job, is that there's always something going on at that club. I do.
What do you make of what Lamine Yamal had to say, though? He was quite specific, saying that in response to Hansi Flick's comments, saying that, look, this isn't about egos. It's more about not starting with the same intensity that you finished the last season with. It's about the energy levels. Where has that gone?
Well, that comes back to my suggestion that with Hansi Flick, when they are asked to keep this very, very high line and to play with this tremendous, because you have to play with a lot of intensity then. Like, the worst thing you can do in football is keep a very high line and not constantly have pressure on the opponent when they have possession, because then they're just going to dink a ball over your high line onto a runner and you're going to be in trouble. So that tactic needs to go along with a constant and relentless press. And that can be a challenge for players to do when you have 50, 60 games in a season, because you go deep into all the cups and everything, which is why I think in a perfect world you would want to refresh that squad a bit more, which is why I think, maybe do cash in on someone like Fermin Lopez if that gives you an opportunity to bring in a fresh pair of legs. It makes it surprising for me that the big move they did, certainly in terms of finances, because of course they don't pay a transfer fee, but they have to pay his wages, was to bring in Marcus Rashford, a player who is not famed for his work off the ball, to put it very, very, very mildly. I think that was a weird move, and I'd be very surprised if Hansi Flick, knowing what his forwards needs to do off the ball to make his system work, I'd be very surprised if it was Hansi Flick who went to the board and say, hey guys, I really want Marcus Rashford. Like, I'm not sure about that. So I think that sort of more the lack of physical, I think both can be true. I think it can both be issues of egos, as Hansi Flick says, but also intensity. But also, when you say issue of egos, maybe one thing you might mean is that these players think they're too good for all the donkey work we have to do now. That could also be what he's referring to, right?
Yeah.
I mean, it makes me question straight away whether they can compete on all fronts. And I think it's a shame if that does turn out to be the case, because you get to the back end of last season and the Champions League finals, semi-finals, which I think we all enjoyed immensely from a neutral perspective. They were brilliant. I think we come out of that thinking that even if Barcelona didn't make the final, Barcelona versus PSG is going to be a motif of the Champions League going forward. And those teams playing as they were in the back half of last season, it's a really exciting prospect, that developing as the real Champions League rivalry. But you just wonder whether Barcelona have got enough in the tank to do it. And we can't judge them after a couple of games of the season. But it comes back to what Lars was talking about the freshness of the squad. If it feels a little bit stale now, what's it going to feel like in March, April? That's the real question. So the Rashford signing, it's not about him coming in and starting. It's about protecting Rafinha. It's about protecting Lamine Yamal and making sure they're full of energy and ready to go. And obviously they're helped by not playing the Club World Cup when it comes to March or April next year. Now, I wonder if Hansi Flick, even liking intensity as much as he does, takes a little look at the Champions League group stage and thinks, you know what, we could spare our efforts here. We don't really need to be the best team in it. And of course, they were they were brilliant in the group stages and went on to make good in it. But then you can give everything you've got, like Liverpool, and it definitely had an effect on the second half of their season. And then they got a dreadful draw in the last 16, and being like maybe the best team in the group stage or the league stage of the Champions League didn't really work out for them. So maybe now that we're a year into this league format, this Swiss format, maybe I think Barcelona and some of the other bigger clubs have a little look at this and think, okay, we know what the numbers we need to hit are for the top 8 and for the top 24. Let's aim towards that and then maybe take a foot off the gas a little bit.
What will we be able to learn from their next meeting against Valencia? They ought to be able to beat Valencia comprehensively, given the last couple of seasons of Valencia.
Well, there are two things. One, we don't even know if they're definitely playing at the Camp Nou yet, which is an issue, obviously, another issue for the club. And the other thing is what we saw from Valencia beating Getafe last weekend. They're really good at catching teams on the break. And so maybe they can make things difficult for Barcelona without really having that much of the game. I think it's an interesting one to watch.
Lars, it's time for your favourite topic, transfer windows. I know you love this so much. And we've just seen...
I don't hate it. Come on, I don't hate it.
No,
I dislike ref chat more than I dislike transfer chat.
Well, as the summer transfer window is closed in almost everywhere except perhaps Turkey and Saudi Arabia, it's time to talk about who...
And Belgium.
And Belgium, are they still going?
Yeah.
I didn't realise that.
Still open for business.
Oh my goodness.
The end of the week.
So there's still some business to be done, no doubt. But let's talk about the business that has been done so far, Lars. What kind of a transfer window has it been? And obviously the Premier League has a huge impact on everybody else's transfers.
It does, because the Premier League is, of course, where the money is. And it's been kind of a strange summer in that all the headlines in England have been about how this is just incredible amounts of money being spent, which is true. But of course, this is not true across the continent. In most other countries, the television deals, which is kind of the economic fuel that the football industry runs on, have been going down, have been shrinking rather than going up. And in some cases, or in one case like France, they don't really have a proper deal at all. They're trying this in-house solution. So there's a lot of financial uncertainty around the continent, and that will affect the transfer market in a very, very big way. And it means that actually selling players to the Premier League very specifically is a huge thing now, to the point where I even wonder, and I think Andy has both spoken and written about this in the past, I do wonder if at some point we will see a very clear tendency of clubs prioritizing player types that they think they can sell on to England. For instance, I think physical capability, like everyone likes big, strong players. That they will be valued and prioritized more by the academies, because you're essentially like raising players to eventually you're hoping to sell them to the Premier League so you can get money in, because the Premier League is where there's money. So that is something that everything kind of. If a Premier League club suddenly turns up and signs a player for 30, 40, 50 million, then that club that they sign from can spend it. So everything kind of springs, the knock-on effect from Premier League business is huge.
That's an interesting point that Lars made there about other leagues looking at players and thinking, will this player fit for a Premier League sale at some point or other? Can you see that going on already from this summer transfer window?
It's not a new thing. It's not a new thing. Like European clubs, and particularly the ones in second tier leagues, have been doing that for 15 years plus. Like looking at how can we really develop players who Premier League clubs want to buy, and that's just a reality of the market. So I think you've seen it with Dutch football becoming more physical, with Portuguese football becoming more physical. The sort of leagues where their economic model, even for the biggest clubs, relies on selling. That is a reality of what you have to do.
Ekitike, maybe an example of that.
Yeah, I think you can look at like Nico Gonzalez as well. In terms of like developing players like that. Of course, he came from Spain, but was developed in Porto, and It's not in the past. I don't think he would have gone to Portugal and bought a 6'2" midfield brute, really, would you? But that is where we are at the moment, and of course they've done very well out of it. It's been successful, but like Lars says, this doesn't really exist in a bubble. So we talked about Porto, and they obviously realised that they had to do some sort of catch up this summer, and Andre Villas-Boas has made sure his new coach Francesco Farioli is very well looked after. Spent a lot of money, and Benfica have been active in the market as well. You've had Sporting with the Gyökeres money. The Portuguese league has spent more than it's ever spent in a window, which is remarkable, because essentially it rests on the shoulders of those three clubs. The clubs at the bottom of the league have got no money at all. In the bottom third of the league have no money at all. So, like Lars says, the Premier League money cannot exist in a bubble. It just can't.
So, having said that, Lars, who are the winners and losers from this transfer windows? Which clubs have done good deals in Europe, and which players perhaps have done really well with the transfer or not, as the case may be?
Well, it's funny. We want to mix it up. We try not to regurgitate. We had a whole segment on Leverkusen, but I kind of like what Leverkusen have done in terms of replacing Florian Wirtz. I mean, we're maybe not spend too much time on it, but getting in guys like Malik Tillman, like Benzahir, Loic Balde to replace Jonathan Tah, seems kind of good. Anis Poku from AZ Alkmaar is an interesting one. They brought in Jal Kwanzaa for Liverpool for a good fee, but yeah, this seems like a crop. It wouldn't shock me if that crop develops nicely together and grows into another competitive team for Leverkusen. One team that I just in the sense that it could make them more. I mean, Juventus. I wasn't super keen on their window until right towards the end when they bring in Lois Openda on loan, which I think he's a very good player. And one of my sort of low key favorites around European football, Edon Zhigrova, the Kosovoan winger, who was last playing for Lille, who I always had tagged as a creative, technical guy who might be too eccentric to play at one of the very, very top clubs. Like the sort of a Balkan charisma character, but he's now gone to Juventus, which is great. Yeah, but the Balkan charisma, which is I just think Juventus was such a boring team to watch last year. So them signing just a relentlessly fun player is, and of course Jonathan David going there as well. So maybe these are transfers that I, as a neutral, because it makes me. I think watching Juventus could be less dull. You
had those three to Kenan Yildiz. I think you got something pretty exciting, and I think the value. Juventus getting value in a summer where they're sort of exhibiting their past mistakes by trying to ditch Dusan Vlahovic and really struggling to do so because he earns 12 million a year and he's only got a year left of his contract. Even with that, they're struggling to shift him. I think this is a move to a new era of Juventus when you're looking at Openda. And if you look at Openda's goal record in the past 3 seasons, they've got themselves a brilliant deal there. Him and David should be a really interesting link. And Zhigrova, who I think it's really interesting how, of course, Kosovo international, that would, of course, if he arrived as a Kosovo player at Juventus, he would take up a non-EU place. So it was quite interesting to see him get a Albanian passport last week. Albania's prime minister is a very out and proud Juventus fan.
I don't know what connection you're trying to make there.
It appears to have been expedited quite quickly.
I hope you've got your visa to Albania already. Let's put it that way. But you mentioned Yildiz there. What about the Turkish transfer window, which is still ongoing? I see that Fenerbahçe have signed Ederson. One of the solutions for them? Possibly?
Yeah, and I think if you look at the way that Fenerbahçe have playing out from the back has been a bit of an issue for them. Obviously, they've got a load of talented players in their squad, but playing out from the back has been an issue for them. So even though many expected Ederson to go to Galatasaray, he makes tons of sense for Fenerbahçe. And his ability to be a goalkeeping playmaker, he could really forget Asensio, John Duran, whoever else you want to talk about, Ederson could be the key for them and help them to really close the gap with Galatasaray right now. Of course, Galatasaray went and spent 27 million on Turkey's starting goalkeeper, Uğurcan Çakır, on deadline day. Now, there's very much a deadline day tax on that. The advantage for them as well as having a homegrown player, because he's from the association, is the fact that they're not paying him anywhere near what the wages of Ederson are. So they're paying him, it goes up in increments season by season, but they're paying him a touch under 2 million euros in the first year. Now compare that to the wage bill and staying away from FFP type business, especially as they're hoping to expand and compete in the Champions League. They've got themselves a top goalkeeper, and even if they paid a lot in terms of transfer fee, in terms of wages, they're actually making a decent saving.
The one that surprises me, Lars, is Stuttgart, who made a ton of money when they sold Voldemort. They're struggling to spend that money. How come?
The way you pronounced them, it almost made it sound like you said Stuttgart made a lot of money from selling Voldemort, which is, I mean, I guess if this is the transfer you want to make, you want him out of the building. He's not doing you any help, not doing you any help in the dressing room.
Lord of the Rings,
very unhelpful character. I've also, there's also a case to be made that like making a mad trolley dash towards the end when everyone knows you've just got a ton of money from a sale is maybe not the most sort of strategic thing to do. They have brought in Bilal El Kanous on loan from Leicester, which I think is quite a canny one. The other clubs in England were looking at him. Hard to be a creative player for Leicester last season, but he showed some very nice touches. I don't hate that. On a completely different note, I want to head back to Italy because I'm kind of fascinated by the two Milan clubs who have had very different windows. Inter, if you look at the players they've spent money on, Luis Enrique from Marseille, Boni from Parma, Andy Diouf from Lens, and Petar Susic from Dinamo Zagreb have come in. Now, the ages of these players, Enrique is 23, Boni is 21, Andy Diouf is 22, and Petar Susic is 21. So that is a very clear sort of, it's a clear sign that they've realized that as much as they've been successful recently, or been doing well recently, that squad was getting old. And they are having to add some young guys to balance that out. Whereas across town, I think Milan have had kind of an interesting window. Because I remember watching them last year and thinking there's so much of this that is just get the ball to Rafa Leao and see if he can do something. Like they had a real problem. I saw several games with Milan where they really struggled to create chances in any other way. And they've completely reconstructed their midfield now. With Luka Modric coming in, of course, being the headline-grabbing transfer, but also Ardon Yashari coming in from Brugge, Samuele Ricci coming in from Torino, Rabiot now, right towards the end of the window, after that punch-up at Marseille, Rabiot's coming in. So that's obviously going to add a completely different, that's a whole new midfield. And Christopher Nkunku coming in from Chelsea. And Nkunku is such I mean, we forget, because he's had a bad time at Chelsea, Nkunku was phenomenal for Leipzig before that. So that's kind of an interesting... And for a team that really needs a bit of star power, like we talked about it also in a previous pod this autumn, there's been a lot of resentment from the fan base at Milan against the current ownership for pursuing this kind of Moneyball type of strategy. Well, now we've brought in a couple of really recognizable names there in Modric, of course, and I mean, interesting. I'm not quite sure how Nkunku will be viewed, but again, he's a former, I think he was player of the year in Bundesliga before when he scored like 20 goals for Leipzig. So he's got a potential to be a real star for them. And Rabiot, who of course is a well-known name, however you feel about him. So feels like a pretty significant window for Milan.
The quality is undeniable, but also the lack of plan is undeniable. It feels like Lars is just like named a string of good players. If we're having this conversation 4 weeks ago, you wouldn't have thought one club has gone out to sort their needs by buying these players. And Rabiot wasn't even on the market like 14 days ago, was he? So I think the Nkunku thing, they start the window looking for a completely different type of striker, and they end up with him. See, where you said Inter versus Milan, from that feels like plan versus no plan, which would concern me if I was a Milan fan. I wouldn't quite put them in my transfer window losers. These are all the guys who are like fiddling about with fax machines at the last minute. Like Athletic obviously going to cast as FIFA rejected their registration to bring back Aymeric Laporte. About Sporting thinking they had Jota Silva, getting him through the transfer matching system with FIFA, and then not managing to register him with the Portuguese league by 1 minute. 1 minute.
Easily done. And did we mention...
Apparently so.
Did we mention how Johan Wissa, formerly of Brentford, of course, almost didn't get his transfer over the line by 1 minute? 1 minute.
Yeah, he forgot to add one signature.
But he got there in the end.
Didn't he? It's easily done for anyone who's ever had a mortgage.
We always ask our experts to recommend a game of the week. And both Lars and Andy will recommend a game of the week for you for this week, tomorrow, on Ask OTC. So don't miss that. But let's reflect on last week's choices. Andy, you picked Girona versus Sevilla. Not bad choice.
Yeah, well, I did feel that it was, kill or be killed at this very early stage of the season. And that's exactly how it turned out. Girona was so bad they made Sevilla look good, which I think is quite an interesting precedent for the season. It's the sort of thing that would make me go and try and buy half a new team on transfer deadline day, and that's exactly what Girona did.
Whereas JJ, Lars, picked Lyon versus Marseille. What did you think of that?
Well, you've already done a whole reaction pod on this, haven't you? So it's not something to go over too much. I'm just a little bit disappointed with Marseille, to be honest. I am keeping an eye on them because, again, JJ flagged them up as like this is the team that could potentially, with the resources they have, put together something that can maybe push PSG a little bit. And based on that game, no.
Thank you for that. Lyon versus Marseille ended up 1-0 to Lyon, and Girona versus Sevilla ended up 2-0 to Sevilla.